They called me the family disappointment for years. While my siblings climbed corporate ladders and bought dream houses, I was just Maya, the quiet one who fixed computers and lived in a cramped studio apartment. But when Dad's medical bills started piling up, and they all suddenly went silent, I discovered something about myself that would change everything. What happened next will shock you, and honestly, it shocked me too. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Maya Chen, and until 6 months ago, I was the family's afterthought. At 32, I was the middle child who never quite found her place between my older brother Daniel and younger sister Amanda. Daniel, 35, was the golden boy who sold luxury cars and lived in a sprawling house in Scottsdale with his wife Jennifer and their twin boys. Amanda, 28, worked as a marketing director for a tech startup, drove a BMW, and constantly posted pictures of her weekend trips to Sedona and California wine country. Then there was me. I lived in a 600-square-foot studio apartment in downtown Phoenix, drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and ran what everyone considered a small-time computer repair business. My family saw me as the one who never grew up, never moved beyond fixing broken laptops, and helping elderly neighbors set up their email accounts. At family gatherings, I was the one they'd politely ask about work, then quickly change the subject when I mentioned installing security systems or recovering data from crashed hard drives. Our father, Robert Chen, 68, had always been the backbone of our family. He immigrated from Taiwan in the 70s, worked double shifts at a manufacturing plant for 30 years, and somehow managed to put all three of us through college without taking on crushing debt. He was proud, stubborn, and never asked for help with anything. Even after Mom passed away from cancer 8 years ago, Dad insisted on maintaining his independence in his modest ranch house in Tucson, about 90 minutes south of Phoenix. Dad had always been healthy, the kind of man who prided himself on never missing work and rarely visiting doctors. He gardened, took long walks, and seemed to have the energy of someone 20 years younger. Which is why the phone call that changed everything came as such a complete shock. It was a Tuesday morning in March when my phone rang at 7 a.m. I was in my tiny kitchen, making coffee and preparing for a day of client calls. The number showed Dad's landline, which was unusual because he typically called in the evenings. "Maya, sweetheart." His voice sounded weak, strained in a way I'd never heard before. "I'm at Banner University Medical Center. I need you to come down here." My heart dropped. "Dad, what happened? Are you okay?" "I had some chest pains last night, thought it was just indigestion, but Mrs. Rodriguez next door convinced me to call an ambulance. The doctors are saying I need surgery, heart surgery." I was already grabbing my keys and heading for the door. "I'm coming right now. Have you called Daniel and Amanda?" There was a pause. "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first." The drive to Tucson felt like the longest 90 minutes of my life. I called Daniel's number 3 times, getting voicemail each time. Amanda's phone went straight to voicemail, too. When I finally reached the cardiac unit at Banner, I found Dad looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, connected to monitors and IVs, but still trying to smile when he saw me walk in. Dr. Patricia Williams, the cardiologist, explained the situation in terms that made my stomach clench. Dad had suffered what they called a widowmaker heart attack. A major artery was 90% blocked, and he needed immediate bypass surgery. Without it, another heart attack was not just likely, it was inevitable and probably fatal. The surgery itself will cost around $120,000, Dr. Williams explained gently. That's before the hospital stay, recovery, medications, and follow-up care. We're looking at close to $200,000 total. Dad's insurance, a basic plan he'd maintained since retiring, would cover about 60% after the deductible. That left us facing nearly $80,000 in out-of-pocket expenses. For most families, that would be devastating. For Dad, living on Social Security and a small pension, it was impossible. I spent that first day at the hospital making phone calls. Finally reaching Daniel at his dealership, his response was immediate and predictable. "Jesus, Maya, that's terrible." "Of course I want to help, Dad, but you have to understand my situation. Jennifer and I just bought the house, we've got the boys' private school tuition, and business has been slow." I mean, I could maybe swing a few thousand, but 80 grand? That's just not realistic right now. Amanda's response was similar when I reached her that evening. Oh my God, poor dad, this is so scary. But Maya, you know I'm still paying off my student loans, and I just put down a deposit on that condo in Tempe. Maybe we could set up some kind of payment plan with the hospital. Neither of them came to Tucson that first week. Daniel claimed he couldn't leave the dealership during their busy season. Amanda said she was in the middle of a crucial product launch at work. Both promised they'd visit soon, both suggested I keep them updated, and both seemed to assume I would somehow handle the financial crisis. What they didn't know, what nobody in my family knew, was that their quiet, unsuccessful little sister had been building something extraordinary while they weren't paying attention. It started 7 years ago, right after Mom died. I was devastated, not just by the loss, but by the realization that I'd been drifting through life without any real direction. My computer repair business was barely breaking even. I had no savings, and I felt completely unprepared for the realities of adult life that had suddenly crashed down on me. That's when I met Kevin Park, a Korean-American programmer who'd been laid off from Intel. He brought me his laptop to fix, and we started talking about his frustration with the tech industry's obsession with flashy startups, while ignoring basic security needs for small businesses. Kevin had an idea for a company that would provide affordable cybersecurity services to local businesses, restaurants, and medical practices. Services that the big corporations ignored because they weren't profitable enough. Everyone thinks cybersecurity is just for Fortune 500 companies, Kevin explained over coffee after I'd recovered his encrypted files. But the pizza place down the street is storing credit card information. The dental office processes insurance claims. The local accounting firm has access to hundreds of tax returns. These small businesses are sitting ducks, and they don't even know it. I looked at Kevin's business plan, and something clicked. This wasn't about building the next Facebook or creating some revolutionary app. This was about solving real problems for real people, one small business at a time. It reminded me of my computer repair work, but scaled up and focused on a genuine need that wasn't being met. I invested my entire savings, about $15,000, to become Kevin's partner in Park Chen Cybersecurity Solutions. For the first 2 years, we worked out of my apartment, cold calling local businesses and offering security audits for almost nothing, just to prove our value. We installed firewalls, set up backup systems, trained employees on password security, and gradually built a reputation as the go-to team for small business cybersecurity in the Phoenix area. The breakthrough came in year 3 when we landed a contract with a local hospital network. One of their locations had been hit by ransomware, and their expensive IT consultants couldn't prevent it from happening again. Kevin and I spent 3 months completely overhauling their security infrastructure, training their staff, and implementing monitoring systems that would catch threats before they became disasters. Word spread fast in the medical community. Doctors' offices, dental practices, urgent care centers, and small hospitals started calling us. Healthcare providers face some of the strictest cybersecurity requirements in any industry, and most small practices couldn't afford the big consulting firms. We filled that gap perfectly. By year 5, we had 43 regular clients paying monthly retainers for ongoing security monitoring, plus dozens of one-time projects each year. Kevin handled the technical development while I managed client relationships and business operations. We hired 2 full-time employees and moved into a proper office space in a business park near Sky Harbor Airport. The money started coming in faster than I knew how to handle it. While my family saw me as barely scraping by, Park Chen Cybersecurity was generating over $800,000 in annual revenue, with profit margins that would make Daniel's car dealership jealous. But I lived the same way I always had. Same studio apartment, same old Honda, same thrift store clothes, and home-cooked meals. The difference was that every month, I was investing 70% of my income. Not in flashy stocks or cryptocurrency, but in boring, stable real estate. Small apartment buildings, duplexes, and commercial properties around Phoenix that generated steady rental income. Properties that most investors overlooked because they weren't glamorous enough. I worked with Patricia Williams, a financial advisor who specialized in helping small business owners build wealth quietly and sustainably. Patricia taught me to think long-term, to reinvest income rather than inflate my lifestyle, and to build multiple streams of passive income that would continue growing even if the business hit rough patches. By the time Dad had his heart attack, I owned 18 rental properties across Phoenix and Scottsdale, plus a significant portfolio of bonds and conservative investments. My net worth had quietly crossed $3 million, and I was generating more monthly passive income than Daniel made selling luxury cars. But I still lived in my studio apartment, still drove my Honda, still wore the same jeans and sweaters I'd owned for years. Not because I had to, but because preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Genuinely didn't care about impressing anyone. The money wasn't about status or luxury. It was about security, independence, and the knowledge that I could handle whatever life threw at me. Which turned out to be exactly what Dad needed, though he didn't know it yet. That first week in the hospital, while Daniel and Amanda made excuses and suggested payment plans, I quietly called Patricia to discuss liquidating some investments. Dad's surgery couldn't wait for extended payment negotiations. Dr. Williams had made it clear that every day we delayed increased the risk of another potentially fatal heart attack. I didn't tell Dad about my financial situation. After a lifetime of providing for his family, of working double shifts to pay for our educations, of never asking for help with anything, I knew he would refuse to let me pay for his surgery. His pride wouldn't allow it, especially not from the daughter he probably worried about the most. Instead, I told him I had worked out a special payment arrangement with the hospital's financial office. I said the business had been doing better than expected, and that Kevin and I had been setting aside money for emergencies. All technically true, though it barely scratched the surface of the whole truth. Dad's surgery was scheduled for the following Monday. That weekend, I transferred $150,000 from my investment account to my checking account, then arranged for a cashier's check to cover all of Dad's medical expenses, including the extended recovery period Dr. Williams had warned us about. When Daniel finally showed up at the hospital Sunday night, he seemed relieved that I'd somehow handled the financial crisis. "I'm glad you figured something out with the billing department," he said, patting my shoulder. "I was worried we'd have to start a GoFundMe or something." Amanda arrived Monday morning, just before Dad was wheeled into surgery. She hugged me and whispered, "Thank God you're so good with this financial stuff. I wouldn't even know where to start with hospital billing." Neither of them asked specifics about how I'd managed to come up with $80,000 in a week. They just seemed grateful that their unemployable little sister had somehow solved the problem. Which meant they didn't have to. Dad's surgery went perfectly. Dr. Williams said the bypass was successful, his heart function was already improving, and his long-term prognosis was excellent. He'd need a few months of careful recovery and ongoing medication, but he could expect to live a normal, active life for many years to come. During his week-long hospital stay, I was there every day. I brought him books, helped him with physical therapy exercises, and gradually watched him regain his strength and optimism. Daniel visited twice, both times bringing his sons to cheer up their grandfather. Amanda came by most evenings after work, usually with flowers or magazines. The hospital billing department sent me a summary statement showing a zero balance. Everything had been paid in full. Dad asked me about it once, and I told him the insurance had covered more than we'd expected. Another truth that wasn't quite complete, but which allowed him to focus on recovery instead of worrying about money. 3 weeks after the surgery, Dad was back home in Tucson, walking slowly around his neighborhood and tending to his garden with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been given a second chance at life. I drove down every weekend to check on him, bring groceries, and help with household tasks he couldn't quite manage yet. During one of those visits, while we were sitting on his back patio watching the sunset over the desert, Dad took my hand and said something that made my chest tight with emotion. "Maya, I don't know how you managed to take care of everything with the hospital bills, but I know it wasn't easy. You've always been the one who stepped up when things got tough, even when your brother and sister were too busy with their own lives. I'm proud of you, sweetheart. Prouder than I think you know." I squeezed his hand and told him I was just glad he was okay. What I didn't tell him was that paying for his surgery had been the easiest decision I'd ever made. The money meant nothing compared to having him healthy and safe. What I also didn't tell him was that this experience had shown me exactly who my siblings really were when things got difficult. And it was a lesson I would need to remember sooner than I expected. Because 6 months later, when Daniel and Amanda's own financial crises began hitting, they would suddenly remember their little sister's mysterious ability to work things out with money. And this time, they wouldn't be nearly as polite about asking for help. But that's a story that would begin with a phone call on a rainy Thursday morning in September, when Amanda's voice on the other end would be shaking with panic and the words she'd say would change everything between us forever. 6 months after Dad's surgery, life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. He was thriving in his recovery, taking daily walks around his Tucson neighborhood, and even talking about planning a trip to visit his sister in San Diego. The cardiologist had cleared him for normal activities, and his energy levels were better than they'd been in years. I continued driving down every other weekend, but more for the pleasure of his company than out of necessity. My business with Kevin was expanding rapidly. We'd landed 3 major contracts with healthcare networks across Arizona, and our reputation for reliable, affordable cybersecurity was spreading beyond the Phoenix area. Kevin had started fielding calls from businesses in Flagstaff and even Las Vegas. We were discussing opening a second office and hiring additional staff. The rental properties were performing exactly as Patricia had projected. Every month brought steady income from 18 different sources, and I'd recently closed on 2 more small apartment buildings in growing neighborhoods near Arizona State University. The college rental market was incredibly stable, and the properties would likely appreciate significantly as Tempe continued developing. But more than the financial success, I was finding genuine satisfaction in the work itself. Our cybersecurity clients weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were real people running real businesses, and our protection made a tangible difference in their lives. When Dr. Martinez's pediatric practice avoided a ransomware attack because our monitoring systems caught it early, or when Rosa's restaurant recovered instantly from a hard drive failure because we'd implemented proper backup procedures, I felt like I was contributing something meaningful to my community. I'd also started mentoring other women in technology through a local nonprofit organization. Every Tuesday evening, I volunteered at a coding boot camp, specifically designed for women returning to the workforce or changing careers. Teaching others about cybersecurity, database management, and small business operations reminded me how far I'd come from the uncertain young woman who'd started fixing computers in her studio apartment. My personal life remained deliberately simple. I'd moved from the studio to a modest 2-bedroom apartment in the same downtown complex, mainly so I could have a proper home office and guest room for when Dad visited. I'd replaced the aging Honda with a reliable Toyota, though I'd chosen the most basic model available. My wardrobe still consisted primarily of comfortable jeans, practical sweaters, and sturdy shoes suitable for crawling under desks to install network equipment. The money continued accumulating, but I felt no pressure to change my lifestyle. Patricia and I met quarterly to review investment performance and discuss long-term strategies. My net worth had grown to nearly $4 million, generating enough passive income that I could have retired comfortably at 32. But I genuinely enjoyed the work, and Kevin and I had ambitious plans for expanding throughout the Southwest. This peaceful, productive phase of my life ended abruptly on a rainy Thursday morning in September when my phone rang at 6:30 a.m. Amanda's name appeared on the screen, which was unusual because she typically texted rather than called, and never this early. Maya, her voice was shaky, almost breathless. "I need to talk to you. Can you meet me for coffee this morning? It's urgent." I was already dressed for an early client meeting, so I suggested we meet at the small cafe near my office. Amanda arrived looking uncharacteristically disheveled. Her usually perfect makeup was smudged, her hair hastily pulled back, and she was wearing yoga clothes instead of her typical polished work attire. "I'm in trouble," she said without preamble, sliding into the booth across from me. "Serious financial trouble, and I don't know what to do." Over the next hour, Amanda explained how her seemingly successful life had been built on increasingly precarious financial foundations. The BMW was leased at payments she could barely afford. The trendy Tempe condo required a mortgage that consumed 60% of her income. Her weekend trips and designer clothes were funded by credit cards that had reached their limits. But the real crisis had started 2 months earlier, when her startup employer began experiencing serious cash flow problems. Amanda's salary had been cut by 40%, and there were rumors that layoffs were imminent. She'd been desperately searching for new positions, but the marketing job market in Phoenix was saturated, and most opportunities paid significantly less than she'd been earning. "I'm behind on everything," she whispered, tears starting to form. "The mortgage, the car payment, the credit cards. I got a notice yesterday that if I don't catch up on the condo payment by next Friday, they're starting foreclosure proceedings." The total amount she needed to avoid immediate financial catastrophe was about $35,000. Enough to bring the mortgage current, cover minimum credit card payments, and buy her time to find new employment or negotiate with creditors. I listened carefully, asking questions about her monthly expenses, job search progress, and potential family support. When I mentioned our father, Amanda's expression became uncomfortable. "I can't tell Dad about this," she said firmly. "You know how he is about money and responsibility. He'd be so disappointed in me. And honestly, Maya, even if I could bring myself to ask him, he doesn't have this kind of money. His pension and Social Security barely cover his own expenses." "What about Daniel?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Amanda laughed bitterly. "I tried calling him yesterday. He went into this whole speech about how he and Jennifer have their own financial obligations. Private school for the twins, the mortgage on that big house, something about needing new inventory for the dealership. He basically said I should have been more responsible with my money and that maybe this would be a good learning experience." I sipped my coffee and studied my younger sister's face. The desperation was real, the fear genuine. But there was also something else in her expression, a kind of expectant hope that made me uncomfortable. She was looking at me the same way she'd looked at Dad when she was 8 years old and wanted something expensive. "Maya," she said, reaching across the table to touch my hand, "I know you've always been smart with money. And I know you somehow managed to help with Dad's medical bills when the rest of us couldn't. I'm not asking for charity. I could pay you back once I get a new job. I just need someone to believe in me enough to help me get through this crisis." The request hung in the air between us. Amanda waited, her eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that felt almost desperate. And for the first time since Dad's heart attack, I found myself in the strange position of having someone in my family actually need me for something important. But I also found myself remembering Daniel's dismissive response to Amanda's crisis. The same brother who'd claimed he couldn't help with Dad's surgery because business was slow. The same brother who'd expressed relief when I'd somehow figured out the hospital billing situation, without ever asking how I'd managed it or offering to help with future medical expenses. "Let me think about it," I told Amanda. "This is a big decision, and I want to make sure I understand all the implications." Relief flooded her face. "Of course, take all the time you need. But Maya, the foreclosure timeline is real. I have until next Friday to bring the mortgage current, or they'll officially start the process." We parted ways with promises to talk soon. I spent the rest of that day distracted, going through the motions of client meetings, while my mind wrestled with Amanda's request. $35,000 was nothing compared to my overall net worth. I could transfer the money that afternoon without affecting my financial stability in any meaningful way. But something about the situation bothered me, and it took me most of the week to identify what it was. Amanda hadn't asked about my financial situation. She'd simply assumed that her computer repair sister could somehow produce $35,000 with a week's notice. Just like she'd assumed I could handle Dad's medical bills without questioning how or why. On Friday evening, I drove to Dad's house in Tucson for our usual weekend visit. He was in excellent spirits, showing me improvements he'd made to his garden, and proudly displaying a photo from his recent visit to the cardiologist. All his numbers were excellent, and Dr. Williams had pronounced him completely recovered. Over dinner, I mentioned Amanda's employment situation in general terms, without revealing the full extent of her financial crisis. Dad's response was immediate and predictable. "That girl has always lived beyond her means," he said with a mixture of concern and frustration. "I tried to teach all of you the importance of saving money, of living within your budget. But Amanda always wanted the fancy things, the expensive clothes and cars. I hope this situation teaches her something about responsibility." "What if she asked you for help?" I wondered aloud. Dad set down his fork and looked at me seriously. Maya, you know I'd do anything for my children. But I also know that sometimes helping someone avoid the consequences of their poor decisions just enables them to make the same mistakes again. Amanda needs to learn to manage her own finances, just like Daniel needs to learn that success isn't about how big your house is. That conversation crystallized something I had been struggling to articulate. My family had always operated under certain assumptions about who was responsible for what, who could be counted on in emergencies, and who needed protection from difficult realities. But those assumptions had been based on appearances rather than actual capabilities. When I returned to Phoenix on Sunday evening, I called Amanda to arrange another meeting. She suggested we meet at her condo, which would give me a chance to see her living situation firsthand. The Tempe condo was everything I'd expected: sleek, modern, and expensive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Salt River, granite countertops gleamed in the designer kitchen, and every piece of furniture looked like it had come from a high-end showroom. It was beautiful, impressive, and completely unsustainable on a marketing coordinator's salary. Amanda had prepared what she called a comprehensive financial recovery plan. She'd calculated exactly how much she needed to avoid foreclosure, researched less expensive apartments she could move to once the crisis passed, and even identified potential side income opportunities like freelance marketing consulting. I know I made mistakes, she said earnestly. I got caught up in trying to keep up with my coworkers, trying to look successful even when I wasn't really earning enough to support this lifestyle. But I've learned my lesson. If you help me get through this, I promise I'll completely change how I handle money. I asked detailed questions about her monthly expenses, her job search strategy, and her timeline for finding new employment. Amanda had clearly put significant thought into the situation, and her plan seemed realistic. She wasn't asking me to fund continued extravagance, just to help her avoid a complete financial collapse. But as we talked, I found myself thinking about Dad's heart surgery, the crisis that had revealed so much about my family's true priorities and capabilities. How Daniel and Amanda had both immediately explained why they couldn't help, while assuming that somehow I would figure out a solution. How neither of them had asked questions about my financial situation or offered to contribute whatever they could manage. Amanda, I said carefully, I want to understand something. When Dad needed surgery, you and Daniel both said you couldn't help with the costs. But now you're asking me for nearly half of what his total medical expenses were. What's different about this situation? She looked genuinely confused by the question. Maya, this is completely different. Dad had insurance that covered most of his surgery costs. You just worked out some kind of payment plan with the hospital. But I'm facing foreclosure. I could lose my home. Right, I said slowly. But what if I told you that Dad's insurance didn't cover as much as you thought? What if the payment plan I worked out required a significant upfront payment? Amanda shifted uncomfortably. I guess I assumed you'd figured out some kind of arrangement that didn't require a lot of cash up front. You're so good with financial stuff. There it was. The assumption that had been bothering me all week. Amanda genuinely believed that her unsuccessful sister had somehow negotiated Dad's medical crisis without any real financial sacrifice. She'd never questioned how I'd managed it because she'd never considered that I might actually have money to manage. I spent that evening thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The years of being dismissed as the family failure while I quietly built a multi-million-dollar business. The months of visiting Dad in the hospital and handling his recovery, while my siblings remained busy with their own lives. The way they'd both expressed relief when I'd somehow solved the medical bills problem, without ever offering to help with future healthcare costs or even asking how I'd managed it. And now Amanda was asking me to rescue her from a financial crisis that stemmed from years of living beyond her means, while still believing that I was barely scraping by myself. Tuesday morning, I called Kevin to discuss something I'd been considering for months. Our cybersecurity business was growing rapidly, but we were limited by our current structure. Kevin handled technical development while I managed everything else: client relationships, business operations, financial planning, marketing, and strategic development. We needed to expand our team and formalize our corporate structure if we wanted to take advantage of the opportunities emerging in the cybersecurity field. I've been thinking the same thing, Kevin said when I outlined my ideas. We're leaving money on the table because we can't handle larger contracts with our current setup. But expansion would require significant capital investment, new office space, additional staff, more sophisticated equipment. I'd already run the numbers with Patricia. Properly expanding Park Chen's cybersecurity would require about $200,000 in upfront investment, money that would come from my real estate portfolio but would position the business for much more aggressive growth. We could realistically double our revenue within 2 years and establish ourselves as the dominant cybersecurity provider for small and medium businesses throughout Arizona. Kevin, I said, what if I told you that funding the expansion wouldn't be a problem? That afternoon, I called Amanda and asked her to meet me at the same cafe where we'd had our first conversation about her financial crisis. She arrived looking hopeful but nervous, clearly expecting me to either agree to help or deliver disappointing news about my own financial limitations. I've been thinking about your situation, I began, and I want to make sure I understand exactly what kind of help you're looking for. Relief flooded her face. Maya, I can't tell you how much this means to me. I know $35,000 is a lot of money, but I promise I'll pay back every penny. Actually, I said, I want to talk about something bigger than your immediate crisis. I want to talk about why you assumed I could help you and what that assumption reveals about how our family operates. Amanda looked confused. I don't understand what you mean. Amanda? Where do you think I got the money to help with Dad's medical bills? She shrugged. I figured you'd been saving money from your computer business, or maybe you worked out some kind of extended payment plan with the hospital. What if I told you that Dad's total medical expenses were over $150,000, and that I paid all of it up front, in cash? Amanda stared at me. That's impossible. You live in a studio apartment and drive a 10-year-old car. Actually, I live in a 2-bedroom apartment and drive a 3-year-old Toyota. But you're right that I don't spend money on visible status symbols. The question is, why did you assume that meant I didn't have money? For the next hour, I explained the real scope of Park Chen's cybersecurity. The revenue growth, the client base, the expansion plans. I told her about the rental properties, the investment portfolio, and the financial planning that had allowed me to accumulate significant wealth while maintaining a modest lifestyle. Amanda listened with increasing amazement and, I noticed, increasing calculation. By the time I finished explaining my actual financial situation, her expression had completely changed. Maya, she said slowly, you're telling me that you're actually wealthy? Like, seriously wealthy? I'm telling you that I've been building a successful business while you and Daniel have been assuming I'm barely getting by. And I'm wondering why none of you ever asked questions about how I managed to handle Dad's medical crisis. She was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing this new information. When she finally spoke, her voice had taken on a different tone. Less desperate, more expectant. Well, then helping me with $35,000 shouldn't be a problem at all. Maya, you could save my house and it wouldn't even affect your lifestyle. I nodded slowly. You're absolutely right. I could write you a check right now for $35,000, and it wouldn't change my life in any meaningful way. Hope bloomed across her face. So you'll do it? Actually, I said, I want to know something first. If our roles were reversed, if you had millions of dollars and I was facing foreclosure, what would you expect me to do to earn your help? Amanda looked genuinely confused by the question. I mean, you're my sister. Family helps family. Right. So when Dad needed help with his medical bills, where was the family? That was different, she said quickly. We didn't know how serious it was, and we thought insurance would cover most of it. Amanda, I called both you and Daniel the day Dad went to the hospital. I explained that he needed immediate surgery and that we were facing massive medical bills. Daniel said he might be able to manage a few $1,000s, but that $80,000 wasn't realistic. You suggested we set up a payment plan. Neither of you came to Tucson that first week. She shifted uncomfortably. We were dealing with our own responsibilities. But we knew you were handling it. I was handling it because someone had to handle it. Not because I was the logical choice, but because I was the only one willing to make the necessary sacrifices. Amanda's expression was becoming defensive. Maya, I don't understand what this has to do with my current situation. Are you going to help me or not? I looked at my younger sister, sitting across from me in her expensive yoga outfit, living in a condo she couldn't afford, asking me to rescue her from the consequences of financial decisions she'd made while assuming I was struggling to make ends meet. And I realized that helping her would only reinforce the same family dynamic that had made my siblings feel comfortable ignoring Dad's crisis. Amanda, I said gently, I'm not going to give you $35,000. Her face fell. But you just said it wouldn't affect your lifestyle. You're right. But giving you money wouldn't solve your real problem. Your real problem is that you've been living beyond your means for years, while building your identity around material status symbols. Taking away the consequences of those decisions wouldn't teach you anything about managing money responsibly. So you're just gonna let me lose my house? Her voice was rising, attracting attention from other cafe customers. I'm going to let you face the same kind of financial crisis that Dad faced, and handle it the same way he did, with dignity, hard work, and support from people who actually care about your well-being, rather than just your ability to maintain appearances. Amanda stood up abruptly. I can't believe you're being this selfish. You have millions of dollars, and you won't help your own sister. Amanda, I spent $150,000 of my own money to save Dad's life while you and Daniel made excuses about why you couldn't help. I'm not selfish. I'm just done being the only person in this family who's expected to make sacrifices. She stared at me for a long moment, her expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that looked almost like hatred. Fine, she said finally. But don't expect me to forget this. And don't expect Daniel to be any more understanding when his problems start. With that, she walked out of the cafe, leaving me sitting alone with my coffee and the strange sensation of having finally spoken a truth I'd been avoiding for months. That evening, I called Dad to tell him about Amanda's situation. Not the details of our conversation, but the basic facts about her potential foreclosure and my decision not to provide financial assistance. You did the right thing, he said without hesitation. Amanda needs to learn that actions have consequences. And Maya, I want you to know something. I've always been proud of all my children, but I'm especially proud of the woman you've become. You've built something real and meaningful, and you've done it with integrity. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for refusing to enable irresponsible behavior. The next morning, I got a text message from Daniel. Amanda told me about your conversation. We need to talk. I had a feeling that my family dynamics were about to become much more complicated, but for the first time in my life, I felt completely confident in my ability to handle whatever came next. Daniel's call came 3 days later, on a Saturday morning while I was reviewing quarterly reports for Maya Chen cybersecurity. His voice carried a tone I'd rarely heard from my older brother, somewhere between authority and barely controlled anger. Maya, we need to meet today. This situation with Amanda has gotten completely out of hand, and frankly, I'm disappointed in how you've handled it. I set down my coffee and walked to the window of my home office, looking out at the downtown Phoenix skyline. Daniel, if you want to discuss Amanda's financial situation, I'm happy to do that. But I'm not interested in being lectured about my decisions. Maya, Amanda is our sister. She's facing foreclosure, and you have the ability to help her, but you're choosing not to. That's not the sister I thought I knew. The condescension in his voice was familiar, the same tone he'd used when we were children, and he wanted to establish his authority as the oldest sibling. But something had shifted in me since my conversation with Amanda, and I found myself unwilling to accept that dynamic anymore. Daniel, where were you when Dad needed surgery? When he was facing $150,000 in medical bills? There was a pause. Maya, that's not the same thing. Dad had insurance, and you worked something out with the hospital. I paid for Dad's surgery myself. All of it. Up front, while you explained why you couldn't help, and Amanda suggested payment plans. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. What do you mean you paid for it yourself? For the second time that week, I found myself explaining the reality of my financial situation to a sibling who had spent years assuming I was barely surviving. I told Daniel about Maya Chen's cybersecurity's growth, about the real estate investments, about the careful financial planning that had allowed me to accumulate significant wealth while living modestly. Daniel's response was immediate and predictable. Jesus Christ, Maya, you're telling me you've been sitting on millions of dollars this whole time? I'm telling you that I've been building a successful business while you and Amanda have been assuming I'm a failure because I don't drive a luxury car or live in an expensive house. Why didn't you tell us? Why keep it secret? The question struck me as both revealing and infuriating. Daniel, when have you ever asked about my business? When have any of you shown interest in what I actually do for work? You've spent years treating my career like a hobby, and my lifestyle like a cautionary tale. That's not fair, Maya. We always supported you. Really? When I told you about landing our first major contract, you changed the subject to talk about your car sales numbers. When I mentioned buying rental properties, Amanda rolled her eyes and said I was becoming a slumlord. Support looks different than dismissal. Daniel was quiet for several minutes. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different energy, more calculated than emotional. Look, Maya, I think we got off on the wrong foot here. The important thing is that you're obviously doing well, and Amanda needs help. Can we meet today to discuss how we can resolve her situation? Something in his tone made me wary. Daniel, I already explained to Amanda why I'm not going to give her money. My position hasn't changed. Maya, you're being unreasonable. Amanda made some mistakes, but she doesn't deserve to lose her home over them. You have the power to fix this situation. And you have the power to help her too. You and Jennifer have a successful business, a beautiful home, and significant assets. If family helping family is the principle we're operating under, why aren't you liquidating some investments to help Amanda? Because $35,000 is a lot of money for us. We have responsibilities, obligations. But it's not a lot of money for me, so I should cover it? Maya, you know that's not what I meant. Actually, Daniel, I think that's exactly what you meant. You think that because I have money, I should use it to solve problems that you don't want to deal with. Just like you thought I should handle Dad's medical crisis while you focused on your own responsibilities. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Daniel alternating between guilt trips, logical arguments, and barely veiled threats about family unity. He suggested that my refusal to help Amanda was selfishness disguised as principles. He questioned whether having money had changed me into someone who didn't care about family anymore. He even implied that Dad would be disappointed in my lack of generosity. But throughout the conversation, Daniel never once offered to contribute his own money to help Amanda, never suggested that he and I could split the cost of resolving her crisis, never acknowledged that his own failure to help with Dad's medical bills might be relevant to the current situation. By the time we hung up, I realized that Daniel's primary concern wasn't Amanda's well-being. It was his own comfort with family dynamics that allowed him to avoid financial responsibility while expecting someone else to handle crises. That afternoon, I drove to Scottsdale to meet Kevin at our office. We'd scheduled a weekend work session to finalize our business expansion plans, but I found myself distracted by the morning's conversation with Daniel. You seem preoccupied, Kevin observed, as we reviewed architectural plans for our new facility. Everything okay? I'd never discussed my family situation with Kevin beyond basic pleasantries. Our partnership was built on mutual respect and shared professional goals, not personal intimacy. But the stress of the past week had left me feeling isolated, and I found myself explaining the recent conflicts with my siblings. Kevin listened without judgment, asking clarifying questions but avoiding advice until I'd finished the entire story. When I finally stopped talking, he was quiet for several minutes. Maya, he said finally, I've known you for 7 years. I've watched you build this business with incredible dedication and intelligence. I've seen you make tough decisions about client relationships, financial investments, and strategic planning. In all that time, you've never made a decision based on emotion or convenience. You always think through the long-term implications and choose the path that creates the best outcomes, even when it's difficult. He paused, organizing his thoughts. Your siblings are asking you to abandon that approach when it comes to family relationships. They want you to make decisions based on guilt and obligation, rather than logic and consequences. But enabling Amanda's irresponsible financial behavior won't help her become more responsible. And allowing Daniel to avoid contributing to family crises won't make him more supportive. Kevin's perspective helped me articulate something I'd been struggling to express. My refusal to help Amanda wasn't about the money. It was about refusing to participate in family dynamics that rewarded irresponsibility while punishing those who made sacrifices. Monday morning brought an unexpected visitor to our office. Jennifer, Daniel's wife, appeared in our reception area just before lunch, asking to speak with me privately. I'd always liked Jennifer, found her more thoughtful and less self-absorbed than my brother, but her presence at my workplace felt ominous. "Maya, I hope you don't mind me coming here," she said as we settled in my office. "But I wanted to talk to you about the situation with Amanda, and I thought it would be better to do it away from Daniel." Jennifer explained that she'd been troubled by her husband's reaction to learning about my financial situation. According to her, Daniel had spent the weekend calculating how much money I must have and discussing ways the family could benefit from my wealth. "He's talking about Amanda's crisis like it's just the beginning," Jennifer said quietly. "He mentioned that we could use help with the boys' private school tuition, and that maybe you could invest in expanding the dealership. Maya, I'm concerned that he's starting to see you as a solution to problems rather than as his sister." I appreciated Jennifer's honesty, but her next revelation was more disturbing. Daniel had apparently called Amanda after our conversation, and together they'd developed what Jennifer described as a coordinated approach to pressuring me for financial support. "They're planning to involve your father," Jennifer said reluctantly. "Daniel thinks that if Dad understands how much money you have, he'll encourage you to help Amanda. They want to have some kind of family meeting where they present a united front." The idea of my siblings manipulating Dad into their financial conflicts made me genuinely angry. He was still recovering from major heart surgery, still adjusting to medications and lifestyle changes. The last thing he needed was stress about family money disputes. "Jennifer, why are you telling me this?" she sighed deeply. "Because I've watched Daniel's relationship with money change over the years. When we first got married, he was motivated by wanting to provide for our family. But somewhere along the way, it became about status and competition. The bigger house, the more expensive cars, the private schools for the boys. We're living beyond our means too, Maya, and I'm worried that Daniel sees your money as a way to avoid making difficult changes." That evening, I called Patricia to discuss something I'd been considering since my conversation with Amanda. If my siblings were determined to treat me as a family bank, I needed to establish clear boundaries and consequences. More importantly, I needed to protect Dad from being drawn into financial conflicts that could affect his health and well-being. "Patricia, what would be involved in establishing a formal family trust or foundation?" "Something that would allow me to help family members when appropriate, but with clear guidelines and limitations." Patricia explained several options for structured giving. "We could establish a family foundation with specific criteria for assistance, or create individual trusts for each family member with predetermined distributions. The key was removing emotion and manipulation from financial decisions by establishing objective standards in advance." "Maya, given what you've told me about your family dynamics, I'd recommend a hybrid approach. A foundation for major assistance like medical emergencies or education, with clear application processes and decision criteria, but also maintaining your personal autonomy over how you choose to use your wealth." We scheduled a meeting for later that week to begin drafting documentation. But first, I needed to have a conversation with Dad about what was happening with my siblings. Wednesday afternoon, I drove to Tucson without calling ahead. Dad was in his backyard, tending to his tomato plants and looking healthier than he had in months. The desert autumn had brought cooler temperatures, and he seemed to be thriving in the more comfortable weather. "Maya, sweetheart, what a nice surprise," he said, embracing me with arms that felt strong and steady. "You look worried about something." Over dinner at his kitchen table, I explained the situation with Amanda and Daniel, not to seek his advice or intervention, but to ensure he understood what was happening before my siblings tried to involve him. Dad listened carefully, asking occasional clarifying questions but mostly letting me talk. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at his garden. "Maya, when your mother and I were young, we made a decision about money and family that I think served us well. We agreed that we would help our children when they faced genuine emergencies or opportunities, but we would never enable poor decision-making or bail them out of consequences they needed to experience." He turned to look at me directly. When you paid for my surgery, that was an emergency, a life-threatening situation that required immediate resources I didn't have. But Amanda's foreclosure isn't an emergency in the same sense. It's the predictable result of living beyond her means for years. Dad's perspective reinforced my own thinking, but his next comment surprised me. Maya, I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've built, but I'm more proud of how you've built it. You've worked hard, made sacrificial decisions, and accumulated wealth without losing sight of your values. Don't let Daniel and Amanda convince you that having money creates an obligation to solve their problems. Thursday morning brought the family meeting I'd been expecting. Daniel called to inform me that he, Jennifer, and Amanda would be coming to Phoenix that evening for dinner, and that they expected me to join them to resolve the family situation. The location Daniel chose was revealing, an expensive steakhouse in Scottsdale that none of us would have been able to afford during our childhood. He was making a statement about status and expectations, setting the stage for a conversation where my wealth would be the central focus. I arrived at the restaurant to find my siblings already seated at a corner table, looking like they were preparing for a business negotiation rather than a family dinner. Amanda had clearly prepared for the occasion, wearing a conservative dress and minimal makeup that made her look younger and more vulnerable. Daniel was in his best suit, projecting authority and confidence. Maya, thank you for coming, Daniel said as I sat down. We wanted to have this conversation because we're concerned about the direction our family relationships are heading. What followed was a carefully orchestrated presentation. Amanda apologized for being emotional during our previous conversation and acknowledged that she'd made financial mistakes. She presented a detailed plan for changing her lifestyle, finding new employment, and becoming more responsible with money. But she maintained that losing her home would make it impossible to implement these changes successfully. Daniel positioned himself as the reasonable mediator, acknowledging that family members shouldn't be expected to solve each other's problems, but arguing that exceptional circumstances called for exceptional responses. He emphasized my unique ability to help without sacrifice, contrasting it with the significant hardship that Amanda's foreclosure would cause. Throughout their presentation, both siblings repeatedly referenced Dad's medical crisis as evidence of my willingness to help family members in need. They framed my assistance with his surgery as precedent for helping Amanda, conveniently ignoring their own absence during that crisis. When they finished talking, they both looked at me expectantly. The restaurant's ambient noise filled the silence as I considered my response. Daniel, Amanda, I appreciate the thought you've put into this conversation, but I need to clarify something important. My decision about Amanda's foreclosure isn't based on whether I can afford to help her. It's based on whether helping her would actually benefit her in the long term. Amanda's expression began to shift from hopeful to defensive. Maya, how is losing my home going to benefit me? Amanda, you've been living beyond your means for years. Your rent and car payments consume most of your income, leaving you vulnerable to any financial disruption. Preventing the foreclosure would allow you to continue making the same mistakes that created this crisis. Daniel leaned forward. Maya, that's not fair. Amanda has already committed to changing her lifestyle. Daniel, Amanda has committed to changing her lifestyle after she gets past this crisis. But people don't change their financial behavior when someone else rescues them from the consequences of that behavior. They change when they're forced to confront reality. The conversation continued for over an hour, with my siblings alternating between emotional appeals and logical arguments. They suggested that my wealth created moral obligations to family members in need. They questioned whether I'd become cold and calculating as a result of financial success. They even implied that Mom would have wanted me to help Amanda if she were still alive. But throughout the entire dinner, neither Daniel nor Amanda offered to contribute their own money to resolve the crisis. Despite presenting themselves as advocates for family unity and mutual support, they both maintained that their personal financial situations made it impossible for them to help. Let me ask you both something, I said as we waited for the check. If our roles were reversed, if Amanda had millions of dollars and I was facing foreclosure, what would you expect her to do? Amanda didn't hesitate. I'd expect her to help you, obviously. That's what family does. And Daniel, if you had my financial resources and Amanda was in crisis, would you help her? Of course I would. Without question. Then why aren't you helping her now? You have assets, equity in your home, retirement savings? If helping family members in crisis is a moral obligation, why does that obligation only apply to me? The question hung in the air uncomfortably. Daniel started to respond about his own financial responsibilities, but I continued before he could finish. Daniel, you and Jennifer have significant assets. You could refinance your house, liquidate some investments, or take a loan against your retirement savings to help Amanda. But you've decided that those sacrifices are too great to ask of yourselves. Amanda's voice was sharp when she responded. Maya, it's not the same thing. You have so much money that helping me wouldn't affect your life at all. You're absolutely right, Amanda. But that's exactly the problem. You want me to help you because it's easy for me, not because it's right or because it will actually solve your underlying problems. I stood up and placed enough cash on the table to cover my portion of the dinner. I'm not going to give you money to prevent your foreclosure, but I am going to offer you something else. Both siblings looked at me with renewed hope. I'll pay for you to work with a financial counselor for 6 months, someone who can help you create a realistic budget, develop a debt repayment plan, and learn to make financial decisions based on your actual income rather than your desired lifestyle. Amanda's face fell. Maya, that doesn't solve my immediate problem. No, it doesn't, but it addresses your real problem, which is that you don't know how to manage money responsibly. Preventing the foreclosure would just postpone the same crisis until the next time you face a financial disruption. Daniel shook his head. Maya, you're being incredibly stubborn about this. We're not asking for charity. Amanda would pay you back. I looked at my older brother, sitting in his expensive suit in a restaurant none of us could have afforded as children, lecturing me about family obligations while contributing nothing to resolve the crisis himself. Daniel, you're right that this isn't about charity. But it's also not about Amanda paying me back. It's about whether I'm going to enable behavior that hurts the people I care about, or whether I'm going to insist that we all take responsibility for our own decisions. I walked out of the restaurant, knowing that my relationship with my siblings had fundamentally changed. They would no longer see me as their unsuccessful younger sister, who needed protection and guidance. But they also wouldn't accept me as an equal, who had the right to make my own decisions about money and family obligations. What I didn't expect was how quickly they would escalate their efforts to pressure me, or how far they would be willing to go to get what they wanted. The first sign that my siblings had decided to escalate their pressure campaign came through an unexpected source. Mrs. Rodriguez, Dad's neighbor in Tucson, called me on a Friday afternoon while I was reviewing security protocols for a new healthcare client. Maya, M.I. Niña, I hope you don't mind me calling, she said in her gentle, accented voice. But I'm worried about your father. He's been upset all week, and today I saw your brother's car in his driveway. They were having what looked like a very serious conversation on the front porch. My stomach tightened. Daniel lived 2 hours north of Tucson and rarely visited Dad without advance planning. The fact that he'd driven down during a weekday suggested this wasn't a casual visit. Mrs. Rodriguez, did Dad seem okay? Physically, I mean. See, he looked healthy. But Maya, he seemed very troubled. Yesterday when I brought him some of my salsa, he was distracted, kept looking at some papers on his kitchen table. He didn't want to talk about it, but I could tell something was weighing on his mind. I thanked Mrs. Rodriguez for her concern and immediately called Dad's house. The phone rang 6 times before he answered, and his voice sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical health. Hi, sweetheart. I was wondering when you'd call. Dad, is everything okay? Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned that Daniel was there today. There was a long pause. Maya, I think we need to talk. Are you free to drive down this weekend? I can come right now if you need me to. No, I'm fine. But Daniel shared. Afternoon? I spent Friday evening and Saturday morning consumed with anxiety about what Daniel might have told Dad. The most likely scenario was that he'd revealed my financial situation and tried to convince Dad to pressure me into helping Amanda. But there were other possibilities that worried me more. The drive to Tucson felt interminable. I arrived at Dad's house just after lunch to find him sitting on his front porch, wearing the same expression he'd worn when he'd had to discipline us as children. Serious, disappointed, but still fundamentally loving. Sit down, Maya, he said, gesturing to the chair beside him. We have some things to discuss. On the small table between our chairs were several printed documents that I recognized immediately. Bank statements, investment summaries, and property records. Daniel had apparently done extensive research into my financial situation, gathering public information about Park Chen's cybersecurity and my real estate holdings. Daniel brought me these yesterday, Dad said quietly. He wanted me to understand the full scope of your financial situation before we talked about Amanda's crisis. I felt a surge of anger at Daniel's manipulation, but I kept my voice calm. Dad, what exactly did Daniel tell you? He said that you have over $4 million in assets, that your business generates hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, and that you own nearly 20 rental properties around Phoenix. He also said that you've been hiding this wealth from the family while letting us worry about your financial stability. Dad picked up one of the documents, a property record showing my ownership of a small apartment building near ASU. Maya, is this accurate? Do you really own all of these properties? Yes, Dad, the documents are accurate. He was quiet for several minutes, studying the papers in his hands. When he looked up at me, his expression was unreadable. Why didn't you tell me? The question I'd been dreading carried no anger, just genuine confusion and hurt. Dad, I never intended to hide anything from you, but I also didn't see the point in making a big announcement about my financial success when everyone in the family seemed to have already decided I was unsuccessful. Maya, I've spent 2 years worrying about whether you could afford health insurance. I've offered to help with your rent, suggested you apply for teaching positions, even considered giving you money for a more reliable car, all while you were sitting on millions of dollars. The pain in his voice was worse than anger would have been. Dad, I never asked you to worry about me. And I never accepted any financial help from you, even when you offered it. But you let me worry. You let me think that my youngest daughter was struggling while you were actually more financially secure than any of us. I tried to explain my perspective, the years of being dismissed and underestimated, the satisfaction of building something successful while flying under the radar. But I could see that Dad interpreted my secrecy as deception, my modesty as manipulation. Dad, when you needed surgery, I took care of it immediately. I didn't hesitate, didn't ask questions, didn't make you jump through hoops or justify the expense. I paid for everything. Because you're my father and I love you. But you lied to me about how you paid for it. You told me insurance covered more than it did, that you'd worked out some kind of payment plan. Maya, you let me believe that you'd made significant financial sacrifices when apparently it was pocket change to you. The conversation was spiraling in a direction I hadn't anticipated. Instead of Daniel pressuring Dad to convince me to help Amanda, he'd apparently convinced Dad that I'd been deceiving the family about my circumstances. Dad, would you have accepted my help if you'd known how much money I have? He was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, probably not. That's exactly why I didn't tell you. Because I knew your pride would make you refuse help, even when your life was at stake. But that was my choice to make, Maya. You took that choice away from me. We talked for another hour, but I could sense that Daniel's presentation had fundamentally changed how Dad viewed my actions. What I'd seen as necessary discretion, he now interpreted as dishonesty. What I'd considered thoughtful financial management, he viewed as secretive hoarding. As the afternoon wore on, Dad eventually arrived at the topic I'd been expecting. Maya, Daniel told me about Amanda's situation, about her potential foreclosure, and your refusal to help her. What did Daniel tell you about his own response to Amanda's crisis? Dad looked confused. What do you mean? Dad, when Amanda asked Daniel for help with the foreclosure, what did he say? I assume he told her he couldn't afford to help with that amount of money. Right. But Dad, Daniel and Jennifer have significant assets. They own a house worth over $600,000. They both have retirement accounts. Daniel's dealership generates substantial income. If they really believed that preventing Amanda's foreclosure was crucial, they could refinance their house or liquidate some investments to help her. Dad frowned. Maya, that would be a significant sacrifice for them. But it's not a significant sacrifice for me, so I should do it instead? Maya, you have much more money than Daniel does. Dad, that's exactly the problem. My siblings want me to solve Amanda's crisis not because it's the right thing to do, but because it's easier for me than for them. They're not asking me to help Amanda because she deserves help. They're asking because I can afford it. The conversation continued until early evening, but I could tell that Daniel's strategy had been effective. Dad wasn't angry with me, but he was disappointed in what he saw as my lack of generosity and transparency. He couldn't understand why someone with my resources would refuse to help a family member in crisis. When I finally left Tucson that evening, I felt more isolated from my family than ever before. Daniel had successfully reframed the narrative, positioning me as the selfish sister who hoarded wealth while her family struggled. He'd turned my financial success into evidence of moral failure. Monday morning brought the next phase of my siblings' campaign. Amanda called me at work, but instead of her usual desperate pleading, her voice carried a new authority. "Maya, I want you to know that I've been talking to a lawyer about my situation. Apparently, there are legal precedents for family members being required to provide financial support in certain circumstances." I set down my coffee and gave Amanda my full attention. "Amanda, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Maya. I'm telling you that if I lose my house, I'm going to explore every legal option for recovering damages from family members who had the ability to prevent my loss but chose not to." The threat was absurd from a legal standpoint, but I recognized it as an escalation in tactics. Amanda was now attempting to intimidate me rather than simply guilt-trip me. "Amanda, you're welcome to consult with any lawyer you choose. But I think you'll find that having money doesn't create legal obligations to prevent other people's financial mistakes." "We'll see, Maya. But I want you to understand that this isn't just about me anymore. Daniel is facing some financial pressures of his own, and if our family starts falling apart because one member refuses to help the others, there could be legal and financial consequences you haven't considered." After Amanda hung up, I sat in my office trying to process what felt like a threat disguised as legal advice. The mention of Daniel facing financial pressures was particularly concerning. If both of my siblings were experiencing money problems simultaneously, the pressure on me to solve their crises would only intensify. That afternoon, I called Patricia to discuss the legal implications of Amanda's threats and to accelerate our plans for establishing formal boundaries around family financial assistance. "Maya, Amanda's threats are legally meaningless," Patricia confirmed. "There's no law requiring you to prevent your sister's foreclosure, and no court would hold you liable for damages resulting from her poor financial decisions." But Patricia's next observation was more troubling. "However, if your siblings are coordinating their pressure campaign, they might try other tactics. They could attempt to claim that you have some fiduciary responsibility as the family's primary financial resource. Or they might try to involve your father in ways that create emotional or legal complications." We scheduled an emergency meeting for the following day to finalize the documentation for a family foundation. The structure would allow me to provide assistance for genuine emergencies, while protecting me from manipulation and establishing clear criteria for help. Tuesday's meeting with Patricia was interrupted by an urgent call from Kevin. Our largest client, a regional hospital network, had experienced a serious security breach. Their system had been compromised over the weekend, and they needed our immediate assistance to assess the damage and prevent further intrusion. The next 72 hours became a blur of crisis management. Kevin and I worked around the clock to contain the breach, rebuild compromised systems, and implement enhanced security protocols. The client's appreciation was overwhelming, and they immediately expanded our contract to include additional facilities throughout Arizona and New Mexico. But while I was focused on professional obligations, my siblings had been busy with their own plans. Thursday afternoon, while I was still at the hospital client's office, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Miss Chen, this is Detective Morrison with the Phoenix Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. We've received a complaint that we'd like to discuss with you. Would you be available to meet with us today?" My blood turned cold. "Detective, what kind of complaint?" "Ma'am, I'd prefer to discuss this in person. Could you come to our office this afternoon, or would you prefer that we meet you at your business?" I arranged to meet Detective Morrison at his office, spending the drive trying to imagine what kind of complaint could have prompted police involvement. The most likely, Full scenario was that Amanda had filed some kind of report claiming financial fraud or family manipulation. Detective Morrison was a middle-aged man with a patient demeanor who seemed genuinely confused by whatever complaint he'd received. His office was cluttered with case files and coffee cups, and he gestured for me to sit across from his desk. Ms. Chen, we received a complaint yesterday from your sister Amanda Martinez, alleging that you've been involved in some kind of financial fraud that's affecting your family's stability. I said quietly, waiting for him to continue. According to the complaint, you've been hiding assets and income from your family while allowing them to believe you were financially struggling. Ms. Martinez claims that you deceived your father about your ability to help with medical expenses, and that you're now refusing to prevent her foreclosure despite having the resources to do so. Detective Morrison paused, reading from his notes. She also alleges that your business may be involved in money laundering or other illegal activities, given the discrepancy between your apparent lifestyle and your actual wealth. I felt a surge of anger so intense that I had to take several deep breaths before responding. Detective, I'm not sure what you'd like me to say about these allegations. Well, Ms. Chen, the claims about your financial obligations to family members aren't really police matters, but the suggestion that your business might be involved in illegal activities does fall under our jurisdiction. For the next hour, I provided Detective Morrison with documentation about Park Chen's cybersecurity, including our business license, tax returns, client contracts, and financial records. I explained our revenue sources, our growth trajectory, and our reputation in the cybersecurity industry. Detective Morrison reviewed the documents carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific clients or contracts. Eventually, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. Ms. Chen, I have to tell you, this appears to be a family dispute rather than a criminal matter. Your business documentation is comprehensive and legitimate. There's no evidence of any illegal activity. He closed the file on his desk. However, I want to warn you that filing false police reports is itself a crime. If your sister continues to make allegations that she knows are untrue, she could face charges. I thanked Detective Morrison for his professionalism and left the police station feeling both relieved and furious. Amanda had crossed a line by involving law enforcement in our family dispute, attempting to use police resources to pressure me into giving her money. But the investigation had also revealed something important. Amanda's complaint had been detailed and specific, including information about my business operations and financial holdings that she shouldn't have had access to. Someone had been conducting extensive research into my affairs, and I suspected that someone was Daniel. That evening, I called Jennifer to ask if we could meet privately. I needed to understand how much Daniel knew about my financial situation and what other tactics my siblings might be planning. We met at a quiet coffee shop in Tempe, away from both our families and our usual social circles. Jennifer looked tired and stressed, older than her 34 years. Maya, I want you to know that I had nothing to do with Amanda's police complaint. I found out about it after the fact, and I think it was completely inappropriate. I appreciated Jennifer's honesty, but I was more interested in understanding Daniel's role in the escalating conflict. Jennifer, how much research has Daniel done into my financial situation? She looked uncomfortable. Maya, he's been obsessed with it since he found out about your wealth. He spent hours online, looking up property records, business filings, anything he can find that's publicly available. Jennifer paused, gathering her thoughts. But Maya, there's something else you need to know. Daniel has been in contact with some kind of consultant or investigator, someone who specializes in family financial disputes. My stomach dropped. What kind of consultant? I'm not sure exactly. But Daniel has been talking about legal strategies for compelling family members to provide financial support. He mentioned something about proving that you have a fiduciary duty to help family members in crisis. The conversation continued for another hour, with Jennifer revealing the extent of Daniel's planning. He'd apparently identified several legal precedents involving family financial obligations, researched my business relationships for potential vulnerabilities, and even discussed the possibility of challenging my mental competency as a way to gain access to my assets. Jennifer, why are you telling me this? She looked directly at me for the first time during our conversation. Because I'm scared of what Daniel is becoming. The man I married would never have considered involving police in a family dispute or threatening his sister's business reputation. but he's so focused on your money that he's lost sight of everything else. As Jennifer and I parted ways that evening, I realized that my siblings weren't just asking for financial help anymore. They were actively working to undermine my autonomy and reputation in an effort to force me to give them money. The next morning, I called an emergency meeting with Patricia and my attorney to discuss legal protection strategies. We needed to document the harassment, establish clear boundaries, and prepare for whatever escalation might come next. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly the situation would reach a breaking point, or how dramatically it would change the trajectory of all our lives. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in November when I arrived at my office to find Kevin waiting in the parking lot with a grim expression and a manila envelope in his hands. "Maya, we need to talk before you go inside," he said, his usual calm demeanor replaced by barely controlled anger. "Someone sent this to our 3 largest clients yesterday." Inside the envelope was a professionally printed letter on expensive letterhead, signed by someone claiming to represent concerned family members of Maya Chen. The letter alleged that Park Chen's cybersecurity was under investigation for financial irregularities, that my personal conduct was questionable, and that clients should consider terminating their contracts to avoid potential liability. The letter was carefully worded to avoid explicit lies while creating maximum damage to my professional reputation. It mentioned the police investigation without clarifying that I'd been cleared of any wrongdoing. It referenced family disputes without explaining that they stemmed from my refusal to enable irresponsible behavior. It suggested financial improprieties without making specific accusations that could be easily disproven. "Kevin, this is a coordinated attack on our business," I said, feeling my hands shake with rage. "My siblings are trying to destroy my livelihood because I won't give them money." Kevin nodded grimly. "2 of the 3 clients called me yesterday asking for clarification. I managed to convince them that the letter was part of a personal dispute and didn't reflect any actual business problems. But Maya, if more of these letters go out, we could lose significant contracts." We spent the morning calling our attorney and discussing legal responses to what was clearly a campaign of harassment and defamation. The letter's careful wording made it difficult to pursue criminal charges, but we could definitely seek civil remedies for business interference and reputational damage. But even as we planned our legal response, I realized that my siblings had fundamentally changed the nature of our conflict. This was no longer about Amanda's foreclosure or Daniel's financial pressures. This was about them attempting to destroy my independence and force me into financial submission through professional sabotage. That afternoon, I received a call from Dr. Williams, Dad's cardiologist in Tucson. Her voice carried the professional concern I'd learned to associate with medical emergencies. "Ms. Chen, your father was brought to the emergency room this morning experiencing chest pains and elevated blood pressure. His heart function is stable, but we're concerned about stress-related factors that might be affecting his recovery." My drive to Tucson was a blur of anxiety and anger. Dad had been doing so well in his recovery, maintaining his exercise routine and managing his medications perfectly. The idea that family stress could jeopardize his health made me feel both terrified and furious. I found Dad in a cardiac monitoring unit, looking smaller and more fragile than he had since his surgery. He was awake but tired, and his expression when he saw me was a mixture of relief and something that looked almost like shame. "Maya, sweetheart, I'm sorry you had to come down here again. I think I just overdid it with the yard work." But Dr. Williams pulled me aside to explain that Dad's episode wasn't related to physical exertion. His blood pressure had spiked dramatically, and his stress hormones were elevated in a pattern consistent with acute emotional distress. "Ms. Chen, your father mentioned that he's been dealing with some family conflicts that have been keeping him awake at night. We need to minimize stress factors during his recovery period, or he could face more serious cardiac episodes." When I returned to Dad's room, he was staring out the window with the same troubled expression I'd seen during our last conversation. We sat in silence for several minutes before he finally spoke. "Maya, I need to tell you something. Daniel came to see me yesterday, and we had a very difficult conversation about the family situation." My stomach tightened. "Dad, what did Daniel say?" "He told me about the letter that was sent to your business clients. He said it was necessary to pressure you into helping Amanda before she loses her house. I felt a surge of rage so intense that I had to grip the arms of my chair to keep from standing up and pacing. Dad, Daniel is trying to destroy my business because I won't give Amanda money to continue living beyond her means. Maya, Daniel said the letter just encouraged your clients to ask questions about your business practices. He didn't think it would cause any real harm to your company. Dad, that letter could cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost contracts. It could destroy the business Kevin and I have spent 7 years building. Daniel is trying to ruin my livelihood to force me to solve Amanda's financial problems. Dad was quiet for a long time, processing this information. When he finally looked at me, his expression had changed. Maya, is Daniel really trying to hurt your business? Dad, the letter was sent anonymously, but it referenced specific information about our family dispute that only Daniel would know. And Jennifer told me that Daniel has been working with some kind of consultant to find ways to pressure me. We talked for another hour, with Dad gradually understanding the extent of Daniel and Amanda's escalation tactics. The police complaint, the threats, the business sabotage, all designed to force me into financial compliance through intimidation and harassment. Maya, I had no idea the situation had become this serious. When Daniel talked to me about family obligations and helping Amanda, I thought he was just trying to encourage generosity between siblings. Dad, they're not asking for generosity anymore. They're demanding submission. They want me to solve their financial problems not because it's right, but because they believe they can force me to do it. That evening, while Dad rested, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Patricia and my attorney to arrange an emergency meeting for the following day. It was time to stop reacting to my siblings' attacks and start taking decisive action to protect myself and my business. The meeting the next morning was held in my attorney's conference room, with Patricia joining us by video call. I explained the escalating harassment campaign, the business sabotage, and the impact on Dad's health. Maya, my attorney said, we have grounds for several civil lawsuits here. Defamation, business interference, harassment. We can seek both damages and injunctive relief to stop their campaign. But Patricia's suggestion was more comprehensive. Maya, I think it's time to consider more dramatic action. Your siblings have demonstrated that they're willing to cause serious harm to force you to give them money. We need to remove their ability to continue escalating. What Patricia proposed was both elegant and devastating. Instead of simply defending against my siblings' attacks, we would go on the offense in a way that would permanently resolve the conflict. Maya, you own significant real estate assets throughout Phoenix. If your siblings are facing financial crises, there's a good chance they've borrowed against their properties or have other debt obligations secured by real estate. Patricia pulled up property records on her laptop. Daniel's house has a mortgage of $480,000 against a property valued at $620,000. Amanda's condo has a mortgage of $290,000 against a property valued at $310,000. Both properties have minimal equity and would be vulnerable to foreclosure if their owners faced additional financial pressure. I began to understand where Patricia was heading. You're suggesting that I could acquire their debt obligations? Exactly. Through a shell company, you could purchase their mortgages from the current lenders. Most banks are willing to sell mortgage debt at a discount, especially if they're concerned about the borrower's ability to continue making payments. My attorney leaned forward. Maya, if you owned their mortgages, you'd have the legal right to foreclose if they continued their harassment campaign. It would give you significant leverage to end their attacks. The strategy was legally sound but emotionally complex. By acquiring my siblings' mortgage debt, I would essentially hold their homes hostage to their behavior. But given their willingness to sabotage my business and jeopardize Dad's health, it seemed like the only way to establish meaningful consequences for their actions. Patricia, how quickly could we execute this strategy? Given your financial resources and the current real estate market, we could probably complete both acquisitions within 30 days. The key is acting before your siblings realize what's happening. That afternoon, I returned to Tucson to check on Dad's condition. His blood pressure had stabilized, and Dr. Williams was optimistic about discharging him the following day. But she emphasized the importance of minimizing stress during his continued recovery. Ms. Chen, your father is physically healthy, but ongoing family conflicts could seriously impact his cardiac function. We need to resolve whatever issues are causing him distress. That evening, sitting in Dad's hospital room, I explained my plan to acquire Daniel and Amanda's mortgage debt. I wanted his perspective before taking such dramatic action against his other children. Dad listened carefully, asking detailed questions about the legal and financial implications. When I finished explaining the strategy, he was quiet for several minutes. Maya, this would give you the power to take away their homes. Yes, Dad, but only if they continue trying to destroy my business and harass our family. If they stop their attacks and focus on solving their own problems, I'd never exercise that power. And if they don't stop? I met his eyes directly. Then they'll face the same consequences they've been trying to force on me: financial ruin and professional destruction. Dad nodded slowly. Maya, I never wanted our family to reach this point. But Daniel and Amanda have made choices that put everyone at risk, including my health. If this is what it takes to stop their behavior, then you have my support. The next morning, Patricia began the process of acquiring my siblings' mortgage debt. Through a carefully structured shell company, we approached Daniel's and Amanda's mortgage holders with offers to purchase their loans at 95% of face value. Both banks accepted immediately, eager to transfer the risk of potentially problematic borrowers. While Patricia handled the financial negotiations, I focused on documenting my siblings' harassment campaign. Kevin and I compiled evidence of the business sabotage, including the defamatory letter and its impact on client relationships. My attorney prepared cease and desist letters that would be delivered simultaneously with notification of the mortgage acquisitions. The process took exactly 28 days. On December 15th, both Daniel and Amanda received registered letters informing them that their mortgages had been acquired by Desert Holdings, LLC, a company controlled by their sister, Maya Chen. The letters explained that any further harassment, defamation, or business interference would result in immediate foreclosure proceedings. Daniel's response was immediate and explosive. He called me within an hour of receiving the letter, his voice shaking with rage. Maya, what the hell do you think you're doing? You can't just buy our mortgages, like we're strangers. Daniel, I can and I did. You and Amanda have spent months trying to destroy my business and manipulate our family. Now you'll understand what it feels like to face real financial consequences. This is insane, Maya. You're threatening to take away our homes because we asked you for help. No, Daniel. I'm threatening to take away your homes because you tried to take away my livelihood. You sent defamatory letters to my clients, filed false police reports, and created so much family stress that Dad ended up in the hospital. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Daniel alternating between threats, pleas, and attempts at negotiation, but I remained firm in my position. The harassment had to stop completely, or they would face foreclosure. Amanda's call came 2 hours later, her voice a mixture of panic and disbelief. Maya, you can't be serious about this. You're really going to put me on the street because I asked for help with my mortgage? Amanda, you're not on the street. You're living in a condo you can't afford while demanding that I subsidize your lifestyle. The foreclosure threat only applies if you continue harassing me and my business. But Maya, how am I supposed to make my mortgage payments when I don't even have a job yet? The same way you were supposed to make them before you asked me for money. By finding employment that covers your expenses, or by downsizing to something you can actually afford. Over the following week, both Daniel and Amanda made various attempts to negotiate different arrangements. Daniel offered to apologize for the business sabotage in exchange for selling his mortgage back to him at a discount. Amanda proposed a payment plan that would allow her to gradually buy back her loan. But I held firm to my original position. The harassment had to stop completely, and they had to demonstrate that they could manage their own financial responsibilities without expecting me to solve their problems. The real test came 3 weeks later, when Amanda found a new job with a marketing firm in Scottsdale. The position paid 30% less than her previous role, but it was stable employment with decent benefits. However, the reduced income made her condo payment even less sustainable. Instead of calling me to demand help, Amanda made a decision that surprised everyone. She listed her condo for sale and began looking for a modest apartment that would fit her new budget. She was taking responsibility for her financial situation rather than expecting someone else to solve it. Daniel's response was more complicated. He initially tried to rally family members against me, calling our cousins and even Dad's sister in San Diego to complain about my financial manipulation of the family. But when these relatives heard the full story, including the business sabotage and false police reports, their sympathy quickly shifted to me. Faced with potential foreclosure and no family support for his tactics, Daniel finally called to arrange a face-to-face meeting. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop in Central Phoenix, on a cold January morning. "Maya, I want to apologize for the letter we sent to your clients," he began, his usual confidence replaced by something approaching humility. "It was wrong to involve your business in our family dispute." I listened without interrupting as Daniel acknowledged the various ways he'd escalated the conflict. The manipulation of Dad, the false police reports, the attempts to pressure me through professional sabotage. He seemed genuinely remorseful, but I'd learned not to trust my siblings' emotional appeals. "Daniel, I appreciate your apology, but I need to understand what's changed. 3 months ago, you were convinced that I had a moral obligation to solve Amanda's financial crisis. What's different now?" Daniel was quiet for several minutes, clearly struggling with his response. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability I'd rarely heard from him. "Maya, I've been in denial about my own financial situation. Jennifer and I have been living beyond our means for years, using home equity loans and credit cards to maintain a lifestyle we couldn't actually afford. When I found out about your wealth, I saw it as a solution to problems I wasn't ready to face." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But when you bought our mortgage, I had to confront reality. We owe more money than I can repay with our current income. The house, the cars, the private schools for the boys, none of it is sustainable." Daniel explained that he and Jennifer had spent the past month working with a financial counselor to develop a realistic budget and debt reduction plan. They were selling their expensive cars, transferring the boys to public school, and considering downsizing their house to something more manageable. "Maya, I understand now why you refused to help Amanda. Giving us money would have just allowed us to continue making the same mistakes. We needed to face the consequences of our decisions." The conversation continued for 2 hours, with Daniel gradually revealing the extent of his financial problems. Beyond the mortgage, he and Jennifer had accumulated over $100,000 in credit card debt, borrowed against his retirement savings, and even taken loans against the dealership's inventory. "Daniel, why didn't you tell me about these problems when you were pressuring me to help Amanda?" "Because I was ashamed, and because I thought if I could solve her crisis, maybe you'd help with mine too. I convinced myself that your money should be used to keep the family together, but really I was just looking for someone else to solve my problems." By the end of our conversation, Daniel had committed to continuing his work with the financial counselor and maintaining the reduced lifestyle he and Jennifer had begun implementing. In exchange, I agreed to sell his mortgage back to a traditional lender at face value, removing the foreclosure threat while maintaining clear boundaries about future financial assistance. Amanda's situation resolved more gradually. The sale of her condo provided enough money to pay off her credit cards and establish a small emergency fund. She moved into a one-bedroom apartment that consumed only 25% of her new income, finally living within her means for the first time in years. More importantly, Amanda began attending financial literacy classes and working with a counselor to understand the spending patterns that had created her crisis. She even started a small side business doing freelance marketing consulting, gradually building additional income through her own efforts. 6 months after the mortgage acquisitions, both of my siblings had fundamentally changed their approaches to money and family relationships. Daniel and Jennifer had successfully reduced their debt by 40% and were on track to pay off their remaining obligations within 5 years. Amanda had built a 3-month emergency fund and was consistently saving 20% of her income. But the most significant change was in our family dynamics. Daniel and Amanda no longer saw me as a solution to their problems, or as someone whose success they could take for granted. They treated me as an equal family member whose decisions deserved respect, even when they disagreed with those decisions. Dad's health continued to improve throughout this period. With the family conflicts resolved and his stress levels reduced, his cardiologist pronounced him fully recovered and cleared him for all normal activities. He even started dating a widow from his neighborhood, a development that brought joy to all of us. The experience taught me valuable lessons about wealth, family, and the difference between helping and enabling. Real help empowers people to solve their own problems and build their own security. Enabling simply postpones problems while creating dependency and resentment. Today, Park Chen Cybersecurity employs 15 people and serves clients throughout the Southwest. Kevin and I have opened a second office in Las Vegas and are exploring opportunities in California. The business continues growing because we focus on solving real problems for real people, rather than chasing flashy trends or easy money. My real estate portfolio now includes 26 properties, generating enough passive income to support several families comfortably. But I still live in the same modest apartment, still drive a practical car, still find satisfaction in work and relationships, rather than material accumulation. I've maintained the family foundation that Patricia and I established, providing structured assistance for genuine emergencies, while avoiding the emotional manipulation that characterized my siblings' previous requests. The foundation has helped with medical expenses for Dad's sister, educational costs for Daniel's sons, and even a small business loan for Amanda's expanding consulting practice. But most importantly, I've learned to value relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. The people in my life today, from Kevin and Patricia to Dad and his new girlfriend, appreciate me for who I am rather than what I can provide. My siblings and I now have honest, adult relationships built on genuine affection rather than obligation or expectation. We celebrate each other's successes, support each other through difficulties, and respect each other's autonomy. It took a financial crisis and some difficult confrontations to reach this point, but our family is stronger and more authentic than it's ever been. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is allowing them to face the consequences of their choices and discover their own strength in the process. It's a lesson that applies to families, friendships, and business relationships. True generosity isn't about solving other people's problems. It's about supporting them as they learn to solve those problems themselves. Looking back, I realized that my siblings' financial crises weren't really about money. They were about identity, self-worth, and the courage to live authentically rather than maintaining appearances. Once Daniel and Amanda stopped trying to impress others and started focusing on their own values and goals, they found both financial stability and genuine happiness. As for me, I continue building the life I want rather than the life others expect me to want. Some days that means working with Kevin to expand our business into new markets. Other days it means teaching financial literacy classes to women starting their own businesses. And some days it simply means having dinner with Dad and listening to his stories about his new relationship. The money continues growing, the business continues expanding, and the family continues healing. But the most valuable thing I've gained from this experience isn't financial. It's the knowledge that I can handle whatever challenges life presents, while staying true to my own values and priorities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.